Hey everyone, it's David. This is the first of 4 videos of the 4 chapters that we were to read for Osborne. This first one is over Old Testament law, which is a subject I particularly find very fascinating and have been looking into a lot recently, mostly due to the fact that it seems to be a subject that always seems to be brought up against Christians, showing whether it's an atheist or whether it's even, other Christians trying to discuss things. It always seems that the law is this distant, foreign thing that we're not used to, and of course it can be. We're 21st century Westernized Americans. We're not, pre-BC Hebrews in any regards, and so because of that, we have a disconnect from the law that we don't understand. But of course, when you look into it and you get into, what God was trying to show His people, it's really a fascinating subject, and I think Osborne does a great job here of explaining it in the short amount of time that he had. But he starts off with these 5 myth conceptions, as he calls them, and he talks about how because of these 5 myth conceptions, there is that disconnect between us and between the Old Testament law. First of all, he mentions it being very ritualistic, and that's why people are so apart from it. And he talks about how people see it as there's sacrifices and there's rules you have to follow, and it just seems kind of archaic, which is also part of the second one. It's outdated. 21st century. This is thousands of years ago, so we've progressed since then, we've changed since then, we've learned new things since then, but I still think that God knew what He was doing then just as He does now, and that everything that was written is still important to us today. But enough of that. The third one he talks about is that it's very that there's ethical issues, ethical in the sense that what is taught and explained in the Old Testament is different from the law of love that Christ gave us in the New Testament. So there can be a disconnect there. Another one is that it's written in a different style. It's not, it's got poetry in it. It's got narratives in it. It's got just straight up instructions in it. It's even got some apocalyptic and prophecy parts in it as well. So it can be very difficult to find a style that it really fits into. And then lastly is the whole view of God, that God in the Old Testament, particularly in the law, was one of vengeance and anger, and was completely different than what Christ was when He came when He came to earth. And so you have those 5 myth conceptions that he talks about. He then goes into the use of Torah in the Old Testament, and he talks about, of course, Torah is we see it as the Hebrew word for law, but technically the word means instructions. And he goes through and he talks about this use that it's used in each of the 5 chapters to explain that this was the Pentateuch written by Moses, and it was important for the Jews and for the Hebrews during the time. He also talks about that the laws in each book, how in Exodus we have the laws for the construction of the tabernacle. In Leviticus we have laws about the sacrificial system and about the priests and about what is clean and unclean between people and between food. And in Deuteronomy, of course, it's almost like a sermon that Moses gives before the Israelites cross into the Promised Land, and it's almost a re-saying of everything that's already been said. A lot of the commands that you see in Deuteronomy have already appeared before in Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers. So Deuteronomy is just kind of a reestablishment of the covenant, and you see a lot of the covenant uses of the covenant in Deuteronomy. He also talks about the whole concept of clean and unclean, and that it wasn't, the clean and unclean had to do with who could enter into the tabernacle. If the priest had to be clean, but if he was going to go before God, he couldn't go before God if he was unclean or unholy. And he talked about what could make people unclean. A corpse could make someone unclean. Eating the wrong foods, the wrong animals could make someone unclean. Even so much as skin diseases such as leprosy, or bodily discharges, as he talks about between men and women, and so he talks about what makes clean and unclean and why it's important. And then the last section he really talks about is the sacrificial system, which is mostly explained in Leviticus, since it was to the priest and they were the ones that offered the sacrifices. But he talks about how even sacrifices were presented before that. In Cain and Abel, Abel was presenting a sacrifice, an offering to the Lord, as Cain was, but Cain's was rejected. Noah offered a sacrifice. Abraham, of course, offered his son for a sacrifice, and of course the Lord then provided a ram. And so sacrifices existed way before Mount Sinai, but they were put into writing, of course, at the time of Mount Sinai for the Israelite community. And of course, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament explains what the whole purpose of sacrifices were and who our ultimate sacrifice is, and what that means for us. He also talks about the 5 different types of sacrifices: the the offerings, I guess you could say, is the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. And of course, those are all mentioned in the first part of Leviticus. And then, of course, he concludes the section talking about the Old Testament in the New Testament, and about how the Pharisees would follow the Old Testament as best they could, and even Jesus did as well, because of course he was a Jew, and so he followed Torah, he followed the law, and of course he even said in Matthew 5, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them," basically explaining how the law was still important and was still the governing and aspects and the governing authority of his life, because of course he wrote it. So he just talks about that, and that's kind of how he concludes with the Old Testament law. So I'll see you in the next video.